Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Field Advisor podcast. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, here today to talk weather with Matt Reardon from Nutrien Ag Solutions. Matt, weather is always a topic at dinner tables, farm shops, coffee shops right now, but it is more than ever because it's been there's nothing short to talk about, I guess, when it comes to weather, whether we're talking thunderstorms, the dust storms. Now that we have the drought map is better. So there's everything to talk about under the sun, I guess is what I'm getting at. No pun intended there. But first, let's recap April. We're sitting here at May 5th. What do you think defined April this year in terms of weather, and how did that compare to maybe what we typically expect?
Yeah, I think April in some ways it was in a lot of ways anomalous, right? We had a lot of rainfall, a lot of storms, particularly in the northern part of the state, a lot of severe reports, tornadoes, etc. Illinois, we lead the country now in 2026 in tornado reports out of any state, and we led the country last year in 2025, so we've continued that trend. But that also is kind of on brand in a way, right? Like fast changing weather in spring in Illinois actually makes a lot of sense, and that part of it is almost normal. And how quickly the narrative has changed in like 6 weeks, if not 4 weeks. We were going into March, we were dry, whole state covered in some form of drought, like at least in early March, if not mid to late March. And we had all these rain events, we had storm events, we had hail, we had tornado, etc. And now we have plenty of water, no drought at all in this state. And it's just totally changed the narrative around most people I'm talking to now. I had folks this morning complaining, hey, we got more rain, complaining about the rainfall. So it's so different than where we were, 30 days ago.
Yeah, definitely. And to your stat on the tornadoes, I've heard Tornado Alley has been shifting. Does that just prove its point that we're in the center of such severe weather?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we are in the center of a new tornado alley, but it has shifted east, the tornado frequency. So how favorable the ingredients going to come together for tornadoes has been increasing kind of along and east in the Mississippi River for the last 20 to 40 years now. Could be land use changes. We're not quite sure at this point, but it has been documented. So I'm not surprised to see the severe reports that we've seen in Illinois this year, but it isn't to say that, okay, Illinois is the new Oklahoma or
Right.
Illinois is the new like Mississippi. Those areas I think are going to steal the show even in future years in terms of like those big, dangerous tornadoes or tornado outbreaks. But we're in Illinois. We've always been a tornado prone state. We have a long history of having tornadoes and severe weather. We might not be number one when you average it out over 10 years, but you're certainly going to get more here than you would get in, say, like Utah or Vermont.
What was that tornado that went through northern Illinois a couple weeks ago? Was it Kankakee? But then I see Lena, Illinois had a bad tornado. What were those on the scale? They were pretty bad.
Yeah, I believe Kankakee was an EF4, and then Lena, Illinois, I believe was an EF3. And yeah, you get up to that level and you're starting to, destroy homes almost completely, and you're risking life and property at that point. So unfortunately, we saw a lot of severe reports up north this year, if not like southern Wisconsin, eastern Iowa, even up into Minnesota, which is a bit odd for spring. I mean, spring is our severe weather season, like March and April in Illinois, but you typically think like later in spring, if not summer, when the severe reports start to get up into like Wisconsin. I can think a number of like big tornadoes from history in that state are like in the middle of summer, when the jet stream predictably moves to the north in those later months. So it was, I think, telling of the broader pattern that we had, which was this very strong Bermuda high. The Bermuda high is this semi-permanent high pressure system. If you kind of look at the map of H's and L's, that's always sitting somewhere off the east coast of the U.S. We call it the Bermuda high because that island sits about a few hundred miles off the east coast of the U.S. That high is somewhere kind of always over there. Well, this year, it's not only been there where we expect it to be, but it's been very strong. And a high pressure system is going to move winds around it in a clockwise fashion. So if you can kind of picture a map of the Atlantic, we're pulling that warm, moist air all the way up in the Midwest, even more strongly than we would be this spring. And that brought that moisture up into Wisconsin, up into Kankakee, up into Lena, Illinois, helping to produce the severe reports up there. Instead of states like Alabama or Mississippi, California has had more tornado reports this spring than Alabama or like
Wow.
Georgia. How often is that ever going to happen?
Not very often because it sounds pretty rare. Yeah. I was up in northern Illinois about mid-April, and they had a lot of ponding and farms up there, and it has delayed planting. We have had reports. I know Lauren on our team, she's up in that area, and they're finally getting planting underway, but there has been some delays. With this severe weather, the rain comes hard and it comes fast, um, and like I said, it has ponded. So talk about soil moisture. Some places have gotten too many, for sure.
Yeah, it's been picking up here recently, and it's such a different conversation from where we just were. I mean, we went part of the planting window. Some people might try it again, maybe late March, some parts of the state, maybe soybeans. And, they were worried about moisture. And now here we are, in early May, and we have too much moisture, people trying to dry out these fields. Problem right now is we're on a little bit of the cooler side this week. I don't think we're going to drop back into like that frost freeze territory that we saw touch the state at the end of last week. However, it's cooler. We're going to have some cloud cover. It's going to be harder to dry out those soils this week. So while the rainfall forecast is getting a bit more sparse in the forecast, fortunately, I think we have a chance here coming through this weekend. We have another chance kind of shortly after that, but they're not these big, heavy rainfall events. But if it stays cool and we don't get that like warm southerly wind that we've had, it's going to be harder to dry out these soils quickly. So there's going to be some windows opening up, I think, over the next 7 to 8 days, but I don't think it's going to be this kind of wide open nature of it. Maybe like we saw right at the end of April and beginning of May.
Before we get to the other items talking about the drought and when year springs, anything else that stands out to you with the severe storms we've been having and any other patterns standing out? Do you foresee that continuing, kind of like you just alluded to, that maybe it'll be lighter rains? Is the severe storms? I won't say they can't pop up, but is that pattern shifting?
Yeah, I think we're in a bit of a lull, severe weather-wise, through the next, I think, at least 10 days. I would maybe even put a line like May 15th or 16th and say, I think I'm waiting until after that to see our next big kind of flurry of severe weather in the middle part of the country. That would include Illinois. We saw this kind of cadence to the severe weather days, if you will, in March and April, where we kind of went 1 week on, 1 week off. And I'm able to pull something up here. While I do that, I'll continue talking. But the cadence of that meant that, like, okay, we had a week in April. Like we talked about the Kankakee one, the Lena one, in like early to mid-April. Then we had another one in late April. And now we're in kind of what we think is like a lull here for the next 10 to 14 days or so. And we're starting to see maybe what is another uptick in that severe weather and what I'll call late May, like at least the third week, maybe the fourth week of May at this point. And so, yeah, more lighter rain events, less these big heavy thunderstorm events, as you just alluded to, Kelsey. We get severe weather that almost always means somebody's getting heavily rained on in the state of Illinois. And that's been a proxy. You get severe weather, we're removing the drought. We're getting the rainfall. We're increasing the soil moistures. So I do think over the next 7 to 10 days without that severe weather, we're going to be helping to dry things out a little bit. We do just have some of the light rainfall and cooler temperatures to contend with. All right. I apologize for the complexity of this graphic. Can you say this okay, Kelsey?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. This is it's a ridiculous graphic, and I apologize, but I'm going to try to make sense of it here, if you'll bear with me. We call this forecasters the chiclets because it looks like little like chiclets, like the gum. And it's crazy. So where we are at today on this graphic is right in the middle on this white line extending top to bottom through the middle of the screen. You can actually come down here. I'm going to zoom in and make it a little bigger and see the dates down here. So we're May 4th here today. Now, I'm going to ask you to ignore most of what's on this chiclet plot and just look at the top line going and extending right out into the future. That's into the forecast here into May, if you look at some of these dates on the bottom. And so what we're seeing here is in each of these boxes are the severe weather ingredients over the continent, like the central continental US, for that given day. And where you see this kind of bright green coloring and the X is a potential severe weather day. The ingredients are kind of coming together for severe weather. And you'll notice that over the next, let's call this 10 days, you maybe have 1 or 2 events in here, probably down further to the south or like the mid-south, but by and large, pretty quiet. What's cool about this graphic is it also, if you go left, we go back in time to the end of March and then the month of April, and we can see what actually did occur. And you see that do you see that cadence, like week on, where you have like 5 or 6 days in a row, week off, you have 5 or 10 days of a break. And that cadence it's very predictable in spring. So we had this late May one, we had an early April one, we had a late April, flurry of events. Now we're in kind of a quiet window. We have a few events here this week, more so over like the southeast. I think we'll have some severe weather today. But I do think this stretch is going to extend further out into mid-May. But you'll notice like, okay, we line up. I got a X here over a bright green one. That's May 19th. And then a few after that, and some pretty, consistent severe weather chances, I think, after that. So that's one of the reasons I'm seeing this kind of late May pick up. There's a number of reasons why we think that like forecast is picking up in late May. I'll stop sharing this.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those is the MJO, the Matt and Julian oscillation, this kind of equatorial circulation that we track for some of its predictability on North American weather, is getting into a phase that we think would be favorable for that severe weather event to set up. It's putting some more momentum in the jet stream. And if you want to get interesting weather in Illinois, you got to get the jet stream cooking over us.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago we got the derecho, and it was the end of June. So, I mean, it's still got to keep our eye to the sky and what storms will be pending for sure. And we didn't even touch on hail too. We had some hail in my town last night. That was pea-sized and it melted right away. But I know that I've been hearing of hail damage as well. So, okay, so let's talk opposite. I'll share my screen real quick and we'll look at the drought map. I'd like for you to tell me what we're looking at here. Obviously, this is a great sign. We still have some drought here in the southern part of Illinois, and there's this little blip right here near Champaign. But wow, you look at the rest of this map and there are some drought-stricken areas.
Yeah, it's the kind of two droughts that we watched that really overwintered in a bad way. Certainly agriculturally, now that we're into like spring and the warm season here, is the High Plains drought. You draw a line west of Illinois and you start to find those higher extreme values there. And that is an extension of a snow drought that really developed over in the northern and western High Plains this year. They just didn't get snowfall. That's an area that gets plenty of it. Let me tell you, like Wyoming, western South Dakota, eastern Montana. And we found this interesting correlation where when their snowpack in winter was poor, they had increased drought the following spring and summer. And what's fascinating is it actually correlated with reduced precipitation. So there's a connection here where the snowpack that you're building in winter helps you to recycle moisture into some of these rainstorms later on in the warm season, which is pretty fascinating. And we found that connection going into this year, and we've seen it come to fruition this year. The snow drought sort of beckoned toward, a rainfall drought later on in spring, which is interesting if you think about it. So we're seeing that to the west. You go to the southern part of the state, you're starting to get into the periphery of this broader southeast drought, which has been an extension all the way going back to last fall, where I can draw some pretty impressive rainfall deficits in like North Carolina, Georgia, northern Florida. We saw earlier this spring wildfires in Florida, wildfires like down near the Everglades, which you don't see very often across the interstate down there. So they've been dealing with that. They actually couldn't plant into some of the moisture there. It was just so dry. They were waiting on planting. The good news for the southeast is, while we're going over a little bit drier during this period, they've gone a little bit wetter. So they've had some rainfall events in here recently. The Carolinas have gotten some rainfall. It's not nearly enough to wipe away the drought. The one area I will say that's been benefiting from somewhat of this recent pattern changes, like Arkansas, Mississippi, the lower Mississippi Valley, those drought classifications are starting to be removed. I would expect that to continue because today we have severe weather chances in Arkansas and tomorrow over Mississippi, and just multiple events and chances for that heavy rainfall. In Illinois, we just got so much rain in April and too many tornadoes, wind, and hail that that moisture got into the soil, and they started to quickly remove those drought classifications.
Mm-hmm. I see this down in Texas. There's just this hole right here in about the center of Texas, which is interesting that it has drought all around it. But, I mean, you'll get rain in some places and you won't in others.
Yeah. Oh, Kelsey, we've done this before. If you hover over the maps menu item on the top left.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And then go to change maps. It's like the fourth or fifth one down there.
Okay.
And let's do, you see the period drop down menu? Let's do like 4 weeks. So I look at this when the new monitor comes out more so than the like absolute drought map.
Sure.
So this is going to tell you where they've been adding or removing drought classifications, green and beige, green where it's been getting wetter intuitively over the last 4 weeks. And that kind of tells you the recent story, I think, a lot better than just the big broad map, especially in the West where, they'll sit red for the rest of summer if they don't get rainfall because they don't get water during the warm season. If they do, it's not very often. And you can see the Southeast is where that drought has been increasing over the month of April. And the Midwest, Texas, the Southern Plains, they're starting to remove some of that drought, obviously with the recent rainfall that we've had there. But you can see both those drought areas have gotten worse recently, not better, at least over the last 4 weeks. Now, I'm guessing if you changed the 4 week to like 1 or 2 weeks, we'd start to maybe see some of those values get removed from like Arkansas, maybe parts of Mississippi. Yeah. So we're seeing more rainfall come through there. So I would expect over the next kind of 4 weeks, so some of those classifications in the lower Mississippi Valley to be reduced. But the Southeast has missed out on some of the better rainfall events, and the forecast is starting to shift over, unfortunately, a little bit drier for them as we go toward mid-April.
Is there any concern of this drought here in the Southeast to etch and go northwest at all?
Yeah, we've started to call this, my colleagues and I, the Elvis rule. And so often in summer, at least in the Midwest, like let's call it the central Corn Belt where this phenomenon is maybe best showcased. If the south, to the south of us stays dry, drought often expands either north or east in summer. That's just kind of where the prevailing surface winds come from. So it's able to kind of travel in that direction. If we get dry to the south of us, let's say over like Nashville or Memphis or Little Rock, and we're all like Elvis fans for some reason, so we ended up calling it the like Graceland Elvis rule, because that's like right in the middle of that area to the south of us where we watch for this. If it goes over super dry, it can sap some of the moisture that's coming out of the Gulf toward what would be our thunderstorms. It's going to steal that and keep it down further to the south like a big sponge. If that area stays really wet, like it was last year in 2025, they were crazy wet down there, had tons of pre-plant issues galore. And that ended up being a reservoir for moisture a lot closer to us, where it could like lend some moisture to us later in the summer. And parts of July, Western Illinois were like near record wet in summer of last year, despite some of the drought concern initially. Right now, it's kind of mixed. If you had asked me in March, I would have said, okay, that area is really dry. They overwintered all that drought. They hadn't gotten the spring rainfall in, and that was a concern. Now, if you go to like Memphis, if you look at their forecast even today, severe weather, you look at the forecast tomorrow, rain, it's starting to wetten up kind of just to our south. Now, the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, they're staying dry, but they're not really due south of us. They're more so like over toward the east. So I'm less worried about dry Graceland, dry Elvis rule right now. And with the more moisture that's coming through here in the near term, I don't think that's a huge forecast signal either way for us. They're certainly not uber wet like they were in 25, but they're certainly not uber dry. They were maybe in a year like 2011 or 2012, or 2012 Memphis was like, had some of their record driest spring, and lo and behold, that drought moved north and impacted all of us here in the Corn Belt right later in 2012.
So time will tell. We'll keep an eye on that for sure. Okay, now I want to shift to talking about the windier spring, these dust storm advisories. And I was telling you before we started recording that I have some of these good conversations right before I talk to you. So you're the first person I'll ask this to, and then you get the brunt of my question of whether it's realistic or not. But I was talking to a friend yesterday who was talking to a meteorologist that said windier springs are the new normal. There was a shift in some kind of pattern, and windier springs are here to stay. What are you seeing on your end? Is there data to support that?
Yeah, the last few springs have been quite windy. I think when this one's all said and done here, we'll look at the data at the end of May. It would seem, at least at this point, from this anecdotal perspective, just sitting here in the middle of Illinois, that it's going to be a windier spring as well. And yesterday was a good example. And last year was really windy, one of the windiest springs on record for the central part of the country, including the Midwest, including Illinois. And I hear that all the time from people, like a strangely high frequency like conversation I get in my travels around the state, around the Midwest, is why is it so windy now? And admittedly, I haven't quite noticed it as much as like a decadal trend. I guess I maybe, when I was a bit younger, wasn't keeping track of like how windy it was in spring. Certainly the last 2 years have been windier than average. Is it this broader like trend that we can expect, over the next 10 to 20 years, we're just gonna have windier springs? That part I'm not sure. The data's kind of inconclusive there. It's not like screaming, yeah, we're definitely windier. But it is interesting. I hear it so much, it's hard to ignore as like a signal. But if you want to say the last two have been windier, yeah, that data comes through pretty clear. And the dust storms, it's kind of this interesting phenomenon of timing and then what I'll call like highly variable weather that can occur this time of year. So if you think about what a dust storm is, you got to get dust. You have to have a source region for the literal dust. You can't make a dust storm over like Antarctica or over the ocean. So you need some source region for that dust. Well, we don't produce a lot of dust in Illinois typically. In spring or in winter, our soils are frozen or they're really wet because we're starting to melt that winter frost. And so that part of the year, you're not going to make a lot of dust in winter with frozen soils. Okay, in fall, we still have a lot of stubble on the ground. We're still kind of green. We've got leaves and what have you. So that part's kind of hard to make dust in fall, but you can get a little bit after the fields are harvested before we start to get into the winter pattern. And in summer, we have this beautiful crop growing all year long that captures the dust and wind. It kind of brings those events down a little bit. And it's really hard to get dust when you have that much crop stand. So there's this little window in spring after we have melted the soils, but before those crops have grown up, where we do have, just sitting there, this bare soil. And if we dry it out on a warm afternoon and you get some of these high winds over these really flat fields, you can start to pick up some of that dust. And when the winds got up to like 50 miles an hour yesterday and the day before on Sunday, they start to blow that across some of the interstates. They have to issue these dust storm warnings because of the visibility drops. And you're not expecting it. You're driving on the interstate on a clear blue sky day, and suddenly the visibility drops down very low. So that's why they issue those dust storm warnings. It's actually a new product over the last few years that the National Weather Service is releasing. And, they'll close highways for it because it is dangerous when it drops that visibility down.
Yeah.
But you're probably not going to see those like in June or July, right? Once it would have to take some sort of like disastrous drought, right, to keep dust around that far into the season. And you're probably not going to get them in winter. Maybe a little pocket like at the end of October when our fields are harvested before that fall pattern has kind of changed over cooler and wintry.
That's interesting you say about the National Weather Service because, thinking back, I don't know, at least 3 years, I've been seeing at least one blowing dust advisory since then on my pop up on my phone. I saw it yesterday while I was in Bloomington driving back. And do you think since they're becoming more normal, or did that huge dust storm we had a couple years ago, unfortunately, that led to fatalities,
Right.
did that spur into being more proactive about these alerts? Because like you said, they come out of nowhere. And I almost wonder, do people know what to do once they see that as well? I saw Jacob Dickey there in Channel 3 in Champaign. He had something about what to do if you're going through that, stop, turn off your lights, things like that. But I wonder if there's just this more proactive approach since it's happening more often now, or it seems like it's happening more often.
Yeah, I think I'll answer there's two questions here. One, in recent years, yeah, unfortunately, the fatalities, I believe, was I-55 between Springfield and St. Louis. Yeah, terrible tragedy with that one. And they do take that into account. That was considered as one of the reasons we need better warnings, advisories, better preparation for these events. And the National Weather Service they try to keep very clear kind of direction on what is impacting people. And we always try to do that with any forecast. Like, okay, we can tell you the numbers, we can show you the pretty pictures, I can show you the chicklets, but what does it mean for us? Like, what is actually going to change in my day-to-day operations? What do I need to be watching out for? We always try to bring it back to that very human perspective. And so they've released these kind of two new warnings here over the last few years. One is not just the dust storm advisory, which exists now, but a dust storm warning. That's the one that's actually going to pop up on your phone. They're going to close highways down because they're so dangerous. We saw evidence of that, obviously, with that tragedy. On I-55, there's another event, I believe, in 2017. And these are events driven by the weather that are infecting people and putting them in danger. Absolutely, we should have some sort of warning. That's why we have warnings. That's why you get tornado warnings, because they can destroy neighborhoods, right? We're not going to send you a warning for, it's going to be cloudy today, even if that might throw off your, picnic plans. And so it's great that they have these new warnings out. There's another one, a very similar one that we have now in winter called a winter squall warning, where you get these squalls that come through. It can be a bright sunny day, a few clouds in the sky, and all of a sudden it's just puking snow on the interstate. You're going 70 miles an hour and visibility drops, and then 5 minutes later clears back out and you're in a bright sunny day. We were noticing these pileups and very similar accidents happening with that. And so we released this new winter squall warning that can now go out, so we can tell motorists via their phones that, hey, your visibility could drop very soon. So I think just preparation, knowing that possibility is out there. If you see that alert, maybe time to get off the interstate, which is where most of these accidents unfortunately occur. You get into some of the more state roads or the county highways, there's more stops, people aren't going as fast, and you can see maybe longer sight lines. But that was the impetus. Yeah, we're concerned about that. And as far as these dust storms, again, the timing is really critical. There's really only these brief windows here in spring and fall where they're even I don't want to say they're not possible other times of the year, but it would take kind of a crazy event to get a dust storm in January or a dust storm in July. There's just, the land use is just not correct at that time of year to get a lot of dust up in the air. But be mindful on days where it's really windy. It can be clear. If we don't have a crop stand out there, you're driving around, you got bare fields, that, that visibility can drop really quickly. If you feel your car getting rocked around by the winds, you got to keep an eye on that dust.
Is it hard to predict dust storms? Like, because it seems like those alerts always come up after or while they're happening, so there's just some lag there that it's just unfortunate.
Yeah, they're hard to predict because you're trying to predict so many different things to all happen at once. One
Yeah.
is the timing, right? And based on what time we get the crops growing, sometimes they can be growing earlier in the year depending on the weather. And once they're up, we know the dust chances reduce pretty quickly. So that kind of adds a complicated scenario because everybody's in kind of a different stage depending on where you're at in the country. And then you need winds to get up high enough. Yesterday afternoon was a good example where all morning the winds weren't up. Then we got through lunch and the winds were 15, 20 miles an hour, enough to maybe keep us out of the fields if you're doing spraying, but otherwise pretty unnotable. Then all of a sudden at 3 or 4 p.m., we started to get enough of that solar heating during the peak heat of the day. We started to pull down those strong winds from aloft, and gusts just jumped up to like 45, 55 miles an hour from Decatur to Champaign. And once you get 50-mile-an-hour winds over any bare soil on Earth, you're going to start to pick it up and blow it around. And so it was this really tight window, like of a 2 or 3 hour period, where all of a sudden that open land just became a resource for the dust to start flying around. That even in 30-mile-an-hour winds, you weren't getting dust storm warnings, from 20 to 30 miles an hour. It was right when it really picked up to 50 when that starts to get flying around dust.
Yeah, just definitely make sure you have your weather notifications on, because that's how I learned about it yesterday.
Yep.
While I was driving, and also that goes for severe storms to tornadoes, etc. Okay, Matt. So looking ahead to May, what conditions should people be preparing for? I know before we started recording, you wanted to talk about El Nino. So maybe as we're looking towards May and beyond, first talk about El Nino and remind us what El Nino is.
Yeah, El Nino's the talk of the town right now, and probably the second biggest thing people are asking me after that wind conversation I was just having. We got new forecast data out today that said this El Nino could be, at least if the forecast data holds true, the strongest on record, which would be fascinating to see from a historical perspective. But what is El Nino? Let's take it back to what I just said a few minutes ago. Like, what are the actual impacts that we have to worry about? El Nino, all it is, how we define it, are warmer than average sea surface temperatures in the central tropical Pacific. Where is that? I'm talking like near Tahiti, way off the coast of Peru and like South America, way out in the middle of the Pacific. We're like way east of Australia. If those water temperatures there are warmer than normal, and they're usually very warm anyway, but if they're even warmer than that, we'll define it at some threshold of an El Nino, about 0.5 degrees Celsius in the positive direction. And once you start to warm up those sea surface temperatures, there are some predictable effects that start to occur in the tropics, which with respect to like where convection sets up, where those tropical thunderstorms want to live in summer and winter. And that can start to then have another somewhat, I'm using the word somewhat, it's carrying a lot of weight here, predictable effect on our weather here. And you get really strong El Nino, the thinking is, well, maybe those effects will be even more magnified, which we see in some years with these strong El Ninos. So that's what we're trying to piece together now. Now, the skinny I'll give you on what it means for us typically, all else equal, that's doing a lot of heavy lifting here because nothing's perfect in meteorology and long-range forecasting, we tend to get more moisture, more summer thunderstorms in these El Nino years because it helps to steer the jet stream kind of out of the northwest, helps bring some of those like northwest flow thunderstorms right over the Midwest. And if you were to plot, all of our good yield years and all of our bad yield years, you would find more El Ninos in the good yield years, and you'd find more La Niñas in the bad yielding years for Illinois, but you'd find one or the other still hanging out. Right, you'd find a La Nina over there in a good yielding year, and you'd find a few El Ninos hanging out in a bad yielding year. But by and large, you would see that relationship pretty solidly between the two. So it's not an end all be all. It's not like I'm sitting here today saying we're not going to have any, drier heat concerns in July. But more often than not, we tend to be wetter and a little bit cooler and milder in July during these El Nino years when we're really make or breaking the crop. So that's as it relates to Illinois. In winter, actually has some more reliable forecast impacts in winter, where I think we could end up, potentially a little bit warmer. Precipitation stuff, it's a little bit harder, but I would kind of lean on the less snow, a little bit warmer in winter if that prediction holds true. But the impacts probably, frankly, for Illinois aren't going to be as significant as I think they are going to be around the world. So typically El Nino, we're looking at more of like the subtropical regions where it can really affect like growing regions outside the US, even like Brazil, India, Australia. Those are areas that are watching it much more closely than maybe we would in Illinois.
I think a lot of farmers would appreciate rain in July and August, since last August the faucet turned right off after July ended. So that would be probably, especially for those soybeans, to really get a good yield on them. Okay, so that's something to be watching for El Nino. What's the timing on that? You said more
It's a
like
good question.
July, August, or July, but when do we start paying attention, I guess, more to it?
Yeah, it's a great question. In a typical year, I'd tell you, well, summer, we're not really watching it too closely because it doesn't really tip in either direction too often in summer. We typically see ENSO, that is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. That's a fancy term for, are we in an El Nino or are we in a La Nina? It's colder cousin. And we typically see that change occur in fall, if not winter, in like December. It's called El Nino because Peruvian fishermen named it after the Christ child because it came around the holiday season in December. That's when we're typically talking about El Nino. What's fascinating about this year in 2026 is this El Nino is already getting its act together. In fact, I think we're already in an El Nino as we sit here today on May 5th. That doesn't happen very often where we're not even to June and I'm already like, I think that's an El Nino and I think it's getting stronger. And the forecast right now, the new data that we have today say, yeah, it's going to be a strong El Nino and it's going to be developing by like now through July and it's going to keep getting stronger. So if we suddenly have a strong El Nino or like even like a modest to moderate one in July, that is bizarre. We typically don't see it pick up that quickly. And so the impacts this summer could maybe be a little bit more aggressive. Could that mean more rainfall for Illinois? Potentially. But we don't have a lot of data on these rare El Nino events. So I can't sit here and say with a ton of confidence, here's exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be an interesting year from a meteorological perspective. It's fascinating from a, hey, what's actually going to happen? It's a common refrain of, hey, we'll wait and see. This is going to be an interesting event.
Good job security, right?
That's right. There you go. Nice sell.
Weather's always happening, so that's always good. Okay, Matt, so I'm sure we'll be talking again in a month and we'll reevaluate that and see what's happening. But before we end here, anything else that you want to bring to our audience in terms of weather outlook or just things to be aware of?
Yeah, I'll say two things. One, that late May forecast, I think the severe events are going to return to the state as we get closer to the end of May, maybe the third or fourth week. But I think I'm calling it like, let's say May 17th and thereafter. I think there's enough kind of stars aligning that we're seeing the momentum return. MJO is going to be in a favorable spot. We're seeing the Bermuda high start to re-strengthen in the long range forecast. All those things kind of come together to say we're going to have some more moisture up in this part of the state. If you get moisture and you get that nice Gulf air mass in Illinois in May, we're going to do what we're going to do, which is make thunderstorms. So I think those are coming back to the table in about 2 weeks. So keep an eye on those. Second thing I'll say with these dust storm warnings, the snow squalls, tornado warnings, these kind of high impact severe thunderstorm warnings. If the National Weather Service is, for lack of a better, blowing up your phone, you're getting that loud alert, it's an emergency. That's what that's for. We're not doing those for cloudy days or some sprinkles coming to the baseball game. If you're getting the loud, buzzy, emergency alert on your phone, it's an emergency and they should be treated like such. So if you're on the interstate and you get one of those squall or dust warnings, it's an emergency. Treat it the same way you would a tornado warning because it is just as dangerous statistically. It's an emergency. You're supposed to go to your safe space. What that means in a dust or squall warning is probably off the interstate if possible, or slowing down and following safe driving rules. So keep that in the back of your head as we go through the rest of the spring.
All right, Matt Reardon with Nutrien Ag Solutions. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Field Advisor Podcast. Unbiased, independent agronomy information to keep your farm moving forward. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, your voice from the field. This podcast is funded by the Illinois Soybean Association Checkoff Program. Stay connected with Field Advisor on social media. Follow, like, and share to keep the conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe to the Field Advisor Podcast on your favorite podcast platform.